For years, a struggling immigrant artist from Queens, New York, named Pei Shun Qian, was painting masterpieces in his garage. Masterpieces that turned out to be forgeries, work that fooled some of the most prestigious art galleries in New York and sold for millions of dollars. When the scandal finally broke in 2013, uncovered by a prominent Manhattan art dealer, the art world was stunned. But there was one uncomfortable truth lost in all the outrage. Qian's fakes were not technically inferior to the originals. In some cases, experts argued they were actually better executed. And that matters because it points to something larger than fraud. Qian himself has maintained he had no idea the paintings would be later sold as originals. By most accounts, he was simply doing what he had spent a lifetime doing, painting. Whatever his intent, the 73-year-old Qian, who had lived in the United States for 4 decades, was arguably an artist in his own right. And his story points to something deeper than art fraud. In Chinese cultural tradition, rooted in Confucian philosophy stretching back more than 2 millennia, imitation is not always seen as theft. It is apprenticeship. In that tradition, the highest compliment you can pay an idea is to carry it further than its creator did. Take calligraphy, for centuries the most prized art form in Chinese culture. The art historian Shen Fu perfectly captures the Chinese approach to knowledge, writing, quote, "Each calligrapher must absorb and command his tradition, then transcend it before achieving a personal style. To create one's own style while having derived it from the ancient masters has been the criterion for greatness throughout the centuries," end quote. In other words, innovation was not understood as creating something from nothing. According to the historian Shen Fu, to invent is to imitate. Quote, adopting the style of a master with the intention not to reproduce, but rather to create a new work, an invention, end quote. Now, of course, this isn't Chinese specific. All civilizations borrow from one another. This is how human progress works. The European Renaissance, for instance, drew heavily from Islamic scholars, who in turn preserved and expanded Greek and Roman knowledge during Europe's Dark Ages. China simply became exceptionally good at what comes next, the refinement and the improvement. Over time, it turned a skill into a strategic advantage, and nowhere is it more apparent today, not in art, but in China's military buildup. Consider what Beijing has done in 3 decades. Its navy went from a coastal defense force to the largest in the world by ship count. Its Air Force now flies stealth fighters that bear a striking resemblance to American 5th-generation designs. Its aircraft carrier program, once non-existent, now fields multiple vessels influenced heavily by Western naval architecture. Even Russia took notice. In the 1990s, Moscow sold China advanced Sukhoi fighter jets under strict licensing agreements. Years later, Russian officials accused Beijing of reverse engineering those aircraft and producing domestic versions without authorization. It's not just happening on the battlefield. According to former defense official Michael Brown, the People's Liberation Army employs hundreds of thousands of personnel who are entirely focused on acquiring foreign commercial and technological secrets. Chinese-linked venture capital firms have invested in American startups, gaining access to proprietary research, cutting-edge patents, and emerging technologies that later surface in Chinese defense applications. One semiconductor founder in Silicon Valley watched employees allegedly steal hard drives, flee to China, and then launch a competing company using his intellectual property. As the company's attorney put it, China was effectively beyond the reach of American courts. This stems from what analysts call civil-military fusion, the Chinese policy requiring private companies to support Chinese state and military objectives. It's very deeply entrenched in China. But here's the critical point, the one that should keep Pentagon planners up at night. China doesn't just copy. It takes what exists, it improves it, and it scales it with the full force of a national strategy. And now Beijing is attempting something that no military power has fully achieved before, an invisible net cast across the Western Pacific. What analysts describe as the transparent ocean strategy. This is a 5-layer surveillance network stretching from the sea floor to space, designed to make the Western Pacific visible to Beijing in real time. This is everything from satellites to smart buoys, autonomous underwater drones, seabed observatories. AI systems tying everything together. The individual pieces are not entirely new. The United States built vast undersea surveillance networks during the Cold War, but no country has yet attempted to integrate all of it from the seafloor to space into a single AI-driven surveillance network and strike network. That's the leap. Chinese and Russian forces demonstrated elements of this system during joint anti-submarine exercises near Vladivostok, sharing acoustic tracking data in real time. Chinese state media described the goal bluntly: to leave American submarines, what Beijing calls our Navy's black sharks, with nowhere to hide. Now, the doctrine behind this invisible net, what Beijing military theorists describe as the maritime adaptive kill web, is itself an evolution of American military thinking. The U.S. military pioneered the concept of the kill chain: find the target, track the target, strike the target. China studied the concept, identified its vulnerability that a single broken link can collapse the entire chain, and built a distributed network instead, meaning multiple paths from the sensor to the shooter, networks that are designed to survive attack. One study from a Chinese naval academy described algorithms capable of calculating dozens of alternative strike routes for the same target in real time. China took our idea and made it better. This matters because the target of all this is Taiwan, China's #1 strategic priority. And China's moves in the Pacific are designed in no small part to ensure that if Beijing moves on Taiwan, American submarines cannot get close enough to stop it. Dozens of war games conducted in the Pentagon, by the Pentagon, by Congress, by outside think tanks have reached the same conclusions. In a conflict with China over Taiwan, the United States could burn through key long-range munitions within days, lose hundreds of aircraft, and face a U.S. defense industrial base that has little capacity to rapidly replace those losses. As retired Air Force Lieutenant General David Deptula put it, the 20 years post 9/11 really ought to be acknowledged as the era of the Great Distraction. We got too distracted from the real threats posed by China and Russia. Those 2 decades were consumed by wars launched in the aftermath of September 11th, first in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. Wars that were driven by the need for retribution and by a fixation on controlling energy resources in the Middle East. Whatever their justification at the time, they came at an extraordinary cost, not just in lives, but in strategic military focus. While America was fighting insurgents in Fallujah and Kandahar, China was busy building a navy. While America was spending nearly $14 trillion on the war on terror, Beijing was modernizing its Air Force, expanding its missile arsenal, quietly laying the groundwork for dominance in the Western Pacific. We were looking the wrong way, and now we're paying for it. China now accounts for roughly half of all global shipbuilding capacity. The United States accounts for less than 1%. America is currently producing just over 1 submarine a year. China's Navy has already surpassed the United States in total fleet size. Christian Brose, a former staff director of the Senate Armed Services Committee and the author of The Kill Chain, has been warning about this for years. Quote, we're in a window of maximum danger. We could throw $1 trillion a year at the defense budget now, and we're not going to get a meaningful increase in traditional military capabilities in the next 5 years. They cannot be produced, end quote. They cannot be produced. Brose argues that the United States needs to fundamentally rethink what military power looks like in the 21st century. Stop pouring money into legacy platforms, massive aircraft carriers, conventional warships that are increasingly vulnerable and painfully slow to replace, and instead scale autonomous systems aggressively: drone aircraft, unmanned surface vessels, underwater drones. But hardware is only part of the problem. The Pentagon's acquisition system, much of it built around the Cold War era, the procurement cycles, remain notoriously slow and poorly suited for the pace of modern technological competition. The defense expert Bill Greenwald put it bluntly to Politico: by clinging to those rigid Cold War planning models, we became the Soviet Union, bloated, bureaucratic, and incapable of moving at the speed that the moment demands, all of which makes what happened this week in Beijing especially troubling. Donald Trump just concluded a 2-day summit with Xi Jinping. Trump returned home touting commercial wins, including a Boeing deal that reportedly fell short of what analysts expected. But Beijing may have walked away with something far more valuable: increasing uncertainty about America's commitment to Taiwan. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated clearly that U.S. policy on Taiwan had not changed. Hours later, Trump appeared to contradict him, first claiming that he discussed Taiwan arms sales with Xi, in his words, in great detail, and then literally moments later suggesting that he had not discussed the matter at all. There was likely little confusion in Beijing about what was said and what was heard. As the Wall Street Journal reported this week, Xi wants what Chinese officials call strategic stability, a predictable relationship in which Washington does not get in the way of Beijing's rise. Trump, meanwhile, is just trying to manage the chaos that he created and appears increasingly willing to trade long-term strategic clarity for short-term commercial optics. America's greatest superpower was never simply its military. It was also its alliances, NATO, NORAD, Five Eyes, the Pacific Partnerships. The real power in those relationships came from our credibility, from allies believing that America meant what it said. Trump has spent years weakening those relationships. You cannot build the coalition needed to counter China's rise while simultaneously making your word worthless to the allies you need. Beijing is not trying to win the moment. It's focused on the long game and shaping the coming century through discipline, industrial scale, and a military system designed to make the Western Pacific increasingly inhospitable to American power, one borrowed innovation at a time. As defense analyst Seth Jones recently observed, the American giant is, quote, lying in bed still. Its eyes are open, and it's recognizing there's a problem, but it's got to get out of bed, end quote. Joining me now is the political scientist and geopolitical risk expert, Mira Rapp-Hooper. Under President Biden, Hooper served as a senior director for East Asia and Oceania in the White House's National Security Council. Now she's a visiting fellow with the Center for Asia Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. Mira, it's great to see you back again. Thank you for being with us.
It's good to see you, Ali.
Help me put some meat on these bones, because it has fundamentally not been the central issue that Americans have been thinking about strategically or militarily for a very long time. And while we've been not paying attention, China has made itself into the most formidable, or close to the most formidable military in the world, if not better.
Ali, I think you put it exactly right in your detailed introduction to this topic here. China has been laser focused for decades on modernizing its military in unprecedented ways, with the goal of increasingly being able to dominate the seas and the skies of the Western Pacific. And make no mistake, exactly as you put it, the main target of all of these strategic efforts is Taiwan, because China has designs on trying to force unification between Taiwan and mainland China, and has since 1949, when the Chinese Civil War took place. What we saw occur in Beijing this week when President Trump visited, however, was a break with decades of political precedents here in the United States on a bipartisan basis. While we have been worried about China's military modernization for a very long time and making efforts throughout the U.S. government to try to equip the U.S. military to be able to deter China and defend against it if it should attack an American ally or partner, beginning in Beijing and since he has left, President Trump has begun to signal very clearly that American policy towards Taiwan may be shifting. He's questioned whether the United States should continue arms sales to Taiwan. He's questioned whether that policy even remains good. And he's made very clear, as you put it, that he's willing to trade long-term American interests for short-term commercial gains.
He said, when referring to Taiwan, we don't know if we call it a country, and it's very far from here. But what was interesting is that this doesn't feel like a thought-out strategy, because Marco Rubio himself said, China says what it always says about Taiwan, and they know that our position hasn't changed. And then Donald Trump, on the plane back and on Fox News, went on and said, well, we don't know. We'll see. We're still thinking about this whole thing. That's a win for China. It may not be exactly what China wanted, a change in position for America, but the idea that Donald Trump has said after decades, we're thinking about it, is a win.
Absolutely. And it's a win because it injects massive uncertainty into Taiwanese politics and demoralizes the Taiwan people, making it increasingly likely that they will feel like they can't stand strong against Chinese pressure. But even if President Trump is not taking on the Taiwan issue using a strategic framework, you can bet, Ali, that Xi Jinping certainly is. From an analyst perspective, it's actually been fairly clear that since President President Trump launched his Liberation Day tariffs last April, Xi Jinping has been using trade negotiations between the U.S. and China to try to pressure American officials to downgrade the U.S. defense relationship with Taiwan. He's placed pressure on us to downgrade defense dialogues, to hold up security assistance, and has multiple times suggested that we should cancel our arms sales. So just one day after President Trump leaves Beijing, to hear him suggest that the United States might indeed be considering canceling arms sales to Taiwan, existential aid on which it relies to defend itself against China, suggests that Xi Jinping may indeed have succeeded in persuading President Trump of his position.
So people describe, I don't know if you ask 10 people on the street what they think China is in terms of its relationship to the United States. Some will say rival, some will say adversary, some will say competitor if you're in business. But unlike during the Cold War, where we didn't really trade with the countries behind the Iron Curtain, the relationship with China is substantially more complicated. What we need our allies in order to put the necessary pressure on China as it relates to what they do economically and with our intellectual property. But we're isolating them. We're making Canada make deals with China that Canada didn't need to make, but they're worried about dealing with the United States, so they're diversifying.
No doubt about that, Ali. And to your point, when you ask the American people what aspects of China's behavior in the world worries them, they point more than anything else to China's intellectual property theft, China's unfair trade practices, and China's stealing of American technology, exactly as you laid out. So while political leadership here in Washington, where I am, are very concerned about Taiwan policy and the need of the United States to keep its commitments, if we want to be able to push back on China in all those other spaces, to blunt its advantages on critical minerals, to stop its theft of intellectual property, and to stand up against its unfair trade practices, there is no pathway forward unless we're working with American allies. That means allies in Asia, but it always also means allies in Europe, where, of course, the president has not been winning many friends in recent months. And I would say that Europeans are less engaged than they have been in many years on issues related to China because the transatlantic relationship itself is in such dire straits.
I was talking to Bobby Ghosh the other day, and he said rare earth minerals are China's Strait of Hormuz. Right, it's a thing we always knew they could use as a point of leverage against us, but hadn't really until we tested them, and then they did. And like the Strait of Hormuz, now America has to be in a position, as it relates to China's rare earths and other minerals, of pulling back on some of our demands to get what we need.
That's exactly right, Ali. I would actually posit that the years 2025 to 2026 have really been defined by choke points. First, China demonstrating that it could cut off critical mineral supplies to the world after President Trump put his tariffs in place. And then after the United States engaged in another war of choice against Iran, Iran throttling off its control of the Strait of Hormuz. China controls as many as 90% or more of the world's rare earths elements that are in production. For the United States to break China's stranglehold on these critical minerals, it's going to need to work with allies, and it's going to take 5 to 10 years to establish the resilience and the independence that we would need to rely only on our friends for these critical supplies. So again, there is no way out, no way through this counter-China strategy unless we're working with those critical allies.
And it requires a strategy. Mira, great to see you again. Mira Rapp-Hooper is a former senior director for East Asia and Oceania at the National Security Council under President.
What makes this story so compelling is that it begins with a man painting in a garage and ends with a warning about the future balance of global power. At the start of this report, we heard about Pei Shunqian, an immigrant artist whose forged paintings fooled elite galleries and experts for years. But the deeper point was never just about art fraud. It was about a philosophy, the idea that imitation is not merely copying, but a pathway toward mastery, refinement, and eventually superiority. And whether you agree with that philosophy or not, the report argues that China has applied that same mindset far beyond the art world, into technology, manufacturing, cyber capabilities, industrial policy, and military strategy. That is the real tension underneath this entire discussion. For decades, the United States operated as though military dominance in the Pacific was guaranteed. Meanwhile, China studied American systems carefully, not simply to replicate them, but to identify weaknesses, adapt them, and scale them faster. The concern now being raised by defense analysts is not that China suddenly became powerful overnight. It's that the West may have underestimated how quickly strategic competition was evolving while America was focused elsewhere. And perhaps the most striking point in this entire conversation is not about ships, submarines, or stealth aircraft. It's about time. Because military strength is not something you can rebuild instantly. Industrial capacity cannot simply be turned on like a switch. Supply chains, shipbuilding infrastructure, rare earth processing, semiconductor production, alliance networks, these are systems built over decades. And many experts now fear the United States spent too many years assuming those advantages would always exist. At the same time, this discussion also reveals how deeply interconnected the modern world has become. Unlike the Cold War, the United States and China are not isolated enemies operating in separate economic spheres. They are deeply dependent on each other economically, technologically, and commercially. That makes confrontation far more complicated and far more dangerous. And then there's Taiwan, the focal point around which so much of this strategic tension revolves. The concern expressed throughout this interview is that uncertainty itself may now be part of the problem. In geopolitics, ambiguity can sometimes prevent conflict. But too much uncertainty can also encourage miscalculation. And history shows that major conflicts often begin not because one side wanted war, but because leaders believed their opponents lacked the will to respond. So the bigger question becomes, has the world entered a new era of great power competition that many people still don't fully recognize? And if so, are democratic nations prepared economically, politically, and psychologically for the scale of that challenge? Because this isn't just about defense budgets or military hardware. It's about industrial resilience, technological innovation, diplomatic credibility, and whether alliances built over generations can still hold under pressure. One thing is certain, the geopolitical landscape is changing rapidly. The assumptions that define the post-Cold War world are being tested in real time, and decisions being made today in Washington, Beijing, Taipei, Brussels, and beyond could shape global stability for decades to come. The challenge now is whether world leaders can manage that competition without allowing it to spiral into confrontation. Because in the end, the cost of strategic failure in the 21st century would not be measured only in economics or influence, but potentially in lives, stability, and the future of the international order itself. If you found this report insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real fact-based news commentary.